Everybody, today we're going to do another one photo deep dive, and if you're new to the show, this is this new thing that we've been doing where we pick one photograph, and we do these about once a week, and we do a complete total immersion, and we analyze the photograph, we talk about the influences and what led up to the picture, we talk about compositionally what's going on, what makes the work interesting, and I think this is something that's really important to do for us as photographers when we study other work. So we've done pretty well with this, and today I'll be the first to admit, I'm picking somebody who's pretty radically different than a lot of other photographers that I've featured on the show. And I'm talking about the Dutch photographer Rineke Dijkstra. And Ms. Dijkstra she's a Dutch photographer living in Amsterdam, and I think her work is absolutely fabulous. She's one of the more exciting contemporary photographers working today. And what I think is going to be interesting, this is why I'm setting you up for this, is compared to a lot of the other past master stuff that we do, Rineke Dijkstra is very different. And part of her thing is she challenges some of our perceptions of what we define as a beautiful photograph or an excellent composition. It's interesting because I think she's got one foot deeply rooted in this grand tradition of past masters. In fact, what we're going to look at today, some painters that came, 15th century and onward. But at the same time, she makes it contemporary and she infuses things into the photograph that challenge that perception and force the viewer to start asking questions about things. And I think this is what makes Rineke Dijkstra pretty important and I think very interesting, because I think those questions that can be posed and be challenged are what make work interesting and what makes photography progress as a medium. And so without further ado, I want to look at a photograph today, and we picked one out of this Bather series that she did. And this one is Kołobrzeg, Poland, July 26th, 1992. So this is the Dijkstra image that we're going to be discussing today. And before we get into this, I want to make a connection to the last piece we talked about when we did a one photo deep dive, which of course was Richard Avedon's Dovima with Elephants. And I want to make a bit of a connection here because I think the takeaway and the underlying theme of what we're looking at today is the way the human figure can be posed to communicate things. And, if we look at this with Dovima, and obviously if you want to dive into this, we did a whole show on it, but Dovima, what she's basically stating through body language, and she has the foot stretched out front, which indicate confidence, probably power, but at the same time, the way her shoulders are tilted back, the head is tilted to the side, and the arms are posed, you have a considerable amount of grace and elegance that come with this. And this is a very different image than what we're looking at today, but there is a connection there. This was done for a fashion publication in the 1950s, and the point of this was to show off this evening gown that was designed by a 19-year-old Yves Saint Laurent, and the purpose of this image is completely different than what we're looking at today. So anyway, but that's the key takeaway, is what can be communicated and the power of making a statement through the human figure. As humans, it's something we relate to, and these things conjure up images in our mind when we see figures posed like this. So that's the takeaway. So if we bump up almost 40 years, this is from 1992, and of course we are talking about Rineke Dijkstra's Kołobrzeg, Poland, July 26, 1992 is the title of the image. And I think that's interesting too. We'll come back to that in a second, that she titles these as with location and date as opposed to the model's name. Anyway, Rineke Dijkstra, this was part of a series. This is a very well-known picture from a series of images that she was commissioned to do on adolescent teens at the beach. And it was this Bather series. And it has, what's interesting to me about Dijkstra is there is a complete grounding in traditions that came before her, but at the same time blowing those wide open by making some changes that challenge how we perceive it. And I think the easiest thing to do is go back and discuss some of these images. Now, another Dijkstra image that was largely the impetus for this series and what inspired it was this. And this is a self-portrait. This is Rineke Dijkstra. And apparently, I guess in the late 80s, probably early 90s, she was involved in a pretty bad bicycle accident, which involved a lot of physical rehabilitation. And part of that included a rigorous swimming routine that she was doing. She emerged from the pool and she had the idea from doing this self-portrait. And this is so different than what we normally think of as a portrait of a human. The lighting is not soft; it's very cold. We have the strange sprinkler heads in the top. It's taken, in a tiled room, so that's very cold. But the figure herself, we see the artist at a near state of collapse, and apparently that was the whole deal. And what she was trying to capture through this was this utter exhaustion of trying to rehabilitate her body after, a pretty serious accident. And so this image essentially inspired some of the next series that she did, including the Bathers series, which we're looking at the image from today. Now, having said that, you can see a lot of the aesthetic elements are transferred over, that challenging what we're thinking here. The cold lighting, she uses a fill flash on this outdoors. It does not necessarily give you the most glamorous skin tones. It's a little bit harsh in some ways. So keep that in mind. The other thing that I want to bring into play here are two past master images. And so this one is Amory Duval's The Birth of Venus from 1862. You can see some very obvious similarities there. And then another one, I think, that probably inspired both these images was the famous Botticelli image, Birth of Venus from 1482. And I did some research on this because a lot of times these past master paintings usually have some epic tale that they're trying to tell you. Tales of morality, revenge, whatever that is, and sometimes incorporating myth into that. And I couldn't find a whole lot on this. There are several interpretations that art historians have on this. None of them are, definitive necessarily. We don't have evidence of that. The most interesting one that I could find that is most probable is that Botticelli was giving you an interpretation of Neoplatonic idea of divine love. So if you think of Plato and the definitions of divine love, and this was kind of bringing that back in, hence the Neoplatonic. But, if you consider what divine love and these notions of what love was represented as visually, and usually you see a younger woman who's very attractive, you have that immediate sense of attraction, but the idea is that beauty ends up transcending that into a divine nature where it's more godly. It's more overarching, and it's not just an infatuation kind of thing. So having said that, and we look at Plato's definition of what was being expressed, the other thing I find interesting is these images were both titled The Birth of Venus, and made me think that there was some kind of tale there about the actual birth of Venus. But another interpretation is that it could be a substitute word for the arrival of Venus, so she's just simply showing up in the ocean. In this image, we see her standing in a large seashell. That must have been one big clam, but the ocean is behind her. And in the later 1862 representation from Amory Duval, she's just standing on the beach. And this is very interesting because this relates directly to the Dijkstra image that we're talking about today. So if we look at them side by side, I'm going to bring those up, you can see the obvious similarities. Now, what we have here is, if you look at the way the figures are posed, are very similar. We'll come back to that in a second. But look at the horizon line in the background. And the horizon line is fairly low in the image. And what this does is it gives you a subconscious, probably subliminal feel that the figure in the image is larger than life. It gives you a sense of power, a sense of that dominance, and that's kind of the idea with the placement of that horizon line, at least in past master painting. But you also see that in the Dijkstra image as well. The other thing that's very interesting is the use of contrapposto. And contrapposto is an Italian term used from painting, and essentially it is this pose that we're seeing. Now, if we look at Venus on the right, you're seeing, classic textbook contrapposto, where her weight is on, I guess, her left leg, yet the right leg is relaxed. Excuse me, the left leg is relaxed. And then look at the hips and the way that weight is shifted in the shoulders. This is a common pose that you see a lot in past master works, and what it does is it was a common tool to basically communicate grace and beauty, and it is very graceful and is very beautiful looking. What we have in Dijkstra's representation of this is we still have the contrapposto, where pretty much the same. The weight on the leg, the left leg is relaxed, and then the shift in the shoulders. If you've ever tried to stand in this pose, it is extremely uncomfortable, which is interesting that so many painters use this as grace and elegance and beauty as well. But when you actually try to do this, it's very unnatural, which is very odd because, painting giving a feeling of a very natural feel, it's not natural. And you replace the beauty of Venus with an adolescent girl. There's there's a real sense of awkwardness that starts to come out with this image. And I think this is where the real interest in this lies. So what we're seeing is very different lighting. We're using fill flash lighting, yet the model in the image and the subject, when we see a photograph of what this pose looks like, it becomes very uncomfortable, very awkward, very unnatural. And also, I mean, look at the sand on her feet, the imperfections and the inconsistencies in skin tones. And what this does is Renee Dijkstra gives us something that's very real and that's very, I think, well, it's real, but it also portrays, I think, under that a sense of innocence. And, if we take that Plato ideal of divine love and apply it to this, for me personally, I like this reality, and I think it does communicate more of that. The youth, the innocence, the reality. This is not a girl whose parents are dolling her up to make a lot of money as a fashion model. This is a real kid, and I really like that. And there's other images in this series too. For instance, here's, in this case it's a male, but also with the contrapposto involved. And there's also an influence here that you see from Cezanne. This is his male bather, and you see some of that in here. And it's also, having roots with Cezanne, it's a very different representation too, because I think Cezanne's figure represents something that's masculine, but also kind of, imperfect, a little bit messy, because it's a completely different style of painting. Whereas when Dijkstra uses that, it kind of comes out very different. You still have maybe a less heavy style of masculinity, but it starts leaning more towards, the beautiful side of things that we're talking about that you see with people like Amory Duval or Botticelli in that sense. But anyway, back to the original one. I just think it's really interesting because, you have the whole idea of youth, awkwardness, adolescence. We were all there at one point, and what that communicates to you. But what also I think is interesting, as I mentioned earlier, the title of this piece, and she just uses locations and dates. So this is Kolobczeg, Poland, July 26, 1992. So it gives it a very documentational quality to it. You're not warming up to this model necessarily through the title. We don't know what her name is. We just know it's a time and a location. And I think that's pretty interesting. And Renee Dijkstra is one of my favorites, I think, of, the contemporary crowd. And, a lot of this is challenging. I'm going to make a musical analogy to this as well here, because I tend to do that a lot. But, there's a group of photographers that emerge in about the 1990s. Dijkstra is one of these. I think Thomas Strutt you could put in that category as well, that were starting to challenge the ideas of what a beautiful photograph was. And a lot of this work is a little bit cold in nature, like we were talking about the stark fill flash earlier, kind of the muted tones of the background with the green that plays against it. But there's something that's a little bit cold and hard to work in with these images. If you make a musical analogy, and I'm going to equate this to, what we have essentially with Western harmony, where if you have what comes out of the Baroque period of classical music, which is essentially tertian harmony and tertian theory and how we put music together. And, particularly in the 20th century, how this notion starts becoming challenged. And so anybody from like Ornette Coleman to Sun Ra, or even more modern rock music bands like Sonic Youth and a lot of the people who are popular today, it's become more accepted now, but those were pretty radical shifts at that time because they were taking essentially what was traditional form, but they were presenting new dissonances in from the traditional harmonies. And so they were making a newer statement with that and challenging the idea of how we interpret that form or how we interpret what is music in that sense. And I think that we're starting to see a little of this too. I think with Dijkstra's grounding with the past master works, there's enough of a grounding to build off of in terms of form, but the way she presents it is much different. She changed out the model. She gave you a photograph of what is actually a very unnatural pose, and you can tell in the photograph, whereas you don't tell it so much from painting. And I think she's challenging the way we're seeing things with these images. And I think this set that she did on Bathers was, phenomenal. She's got some other work too. She's definitely worth checking out. Go research her online. She does some video works as well, and I think she's just an absolutely wonderful artist. So I hope you guys have found this interesting, and I picked Renee Dijkstra for a number of reasons, mainly because I think there was a tie-in with that Richard Avedon piece that we talked about in the last One Photo Deep Dive that we did. And then two, I think that it's important, I haven't covered a lot of contemporary photographers on this show. And it's not really any intention that I've done it that way, but I've had some requests lately to cover more contemporary people. And I think Renee Dijkstra, for me, is one of those photographers who is really important to look at in that sense, because One, it's going to be a little challenging, and some of you may have found this to be very different than a lot of the stuff that we've covered on the show before, and that was completely my intention. And I hope you've been challenged in an interesting way, and I hope you look at this just in terms of, I don't know, some of the overarching things you could say about it, but the fact that I like Renee Dijkstra's work because she raises questions and she forces the viewer to look at something different. Sometimes that makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes it puts us off. Sometimes it can be a little cold and a little more difficult to warm up to. But I think that that's what makes her work so interesting. Like I said, she's done some other pieces too. She's done a lot of video work. There was a piece that I saw last summer when I was actually in Seattle that was a video piece, and it was a video of a bunch of school kids in England that were reacting to it was a Picasso piece, and what they were thinking and what the piece was saying to them. And that was the piece, was this reaction. And I think that that fundamental relationship with the viewer is something that's very important to Renee Dijkstra. I've never met her, I don't know her, and so I'm kind of assuming a lot of things here, but that's what I get out of her work, and that's why I think she's so wonderful. So anyway, guys, this has been another episode of The Art of Photography and another One Photo Deep Dive. We're going to do more of these in upcoming shows. I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.